and think through them upon our lips and speak through them in our hearts and draw us to you in them. Amen. Amen. Let's see. So to untangle the gospel just a little bit, the main message there is about coming to light, coming to the light. And as it says that what is true is what brings us to the light. What is real is what brings us to the light. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about times over all these years of ministry when people have come to me and they've wanted somehow to find more light in their life for one reason or another. And sometimes they've come because there was darkness in their life, but sometimes they just come because they want more light, which is a perfectly good thing to do. It's like physically, we can go and get help when we're sick, but it's even better when we're well and we're trying to even be more well. So one of the things that happened several years ago was there was a woman that came, and I think this is what she was looking for in life. But what she wanted me to do was she wanted me to give her a Bible verse that was something that would help her each day that she could say through the years. And I did that. I found one that was appropriate for her. But it really struck my attention when I thought about that this week that this psalm has a perfect light for that. I want you to do something I don't usually ask you to do. I want you to actually take it out and look at it. And so you don't have to look it up in the Bible. I know we Episcopalians have trouble finding things in the Bible sometimes. So that's why we've written it out nicely on this insert. If you'll take a look at the psalm, notice first of all that this psalm is not all of Psalm 107, which is a psalm that sort of goes on and 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 on. But it is a segment of Psalm 107, verses 1 through 3, and then 17 to 22. But I want you to notice that first line, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. That stood out to me, because that's not a bad line to say to ourselves over and over and over again. And it is a line that can bring a lot of life and light into our life. It's even one that can be breathed. There is a whole meditation in Christian meditation about meditating on the Psalms and taking either a line like this and breathing in the first half of the line and breathing out the second half, or even taking a whole verse and doing that. But to breathe, this psalm would be when you breathe in, give thanks to the Lord, and when you breathe out, to breathe out, for he is good. Wow, what a wonderful way to attach to your breath, because you breathe all the time. And so if you attach this line, then you're kind of breathing this prayer over and over through your day. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. Having said that, I've told you a few weeks ago that in Hebrew tradition, the males memorized the Psalms. Remember me telling you that a while back? Okay. And the first line, the first verse of the psalm was intended to call the whole psalm to mind. So that line can become even more important when we read what follows. And I want you to notice two things. First of all, in this segment, this whole psalm is bookmarked by this first line, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. And flip over the last line, and tell of his acts with shouts of joy. In other words, everything that comes between this is that telling of his acts of goodness for the people of Israel. They're telling about how God has redeemed them, rescued them from the hand of their enemies. They're telling about how he's gathered them out of all of the lands. They're telling about how when they were in trouble, he delivered them from their distress. They're telling about how he healed them and saved them from the grave. These are all stories from the stories of the people of Israel about how they saw God acting in their lives as a people. And so when we hear that first verse, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, these are the tales of his goodness, that God delivered, that God rescued, that God redeemed, that God helped in time of trouble. And we still retell those when we read this psalm. And for us, it can be told not just about a people long ago, and certainly not just about all Christians and only Christians, but about every single person. That in every single person's life, God is doing deeds of goodness. Whether we recognize that goodness is coming from God or not. Because God's not dependent on whether we recognize it is coming from God. God doesn't have to have us recognize that it's coming from God for God to still give us goodness. God will rain down goodness on all of us. But it helps us to come to the light. It helps us to come to the light when we recognize the goodness and recognize where it comes from. Recognize that it comes ultimately from God. Now, problem is that we tend to go through our life and through our days not really focus that much on goodness and the goodness that's in our days. What tends to catch our attention during the course of a day are the problems that come up. The problems that need our attention, the problems that may be able to be solved in a day, the problems that may take a long time to solve, the problems that are little problems, like the heel fell off my shoe, or the problems that are big problems, like somebody in my family's dying. Those problems get our attention. And it's almost as if we kept a running list of the problems going in our head. And it's that kind of list of problems that often leads us sort of into a darkness where we don't even see the light of goodness, because all we can see are the problems. Well, what the gospel is saying is that God in his goodness through Jesus has basically solved the biggest problem of all through his death and resurrection. That through his death and resurrection, what Jesus does is open us to the door to say that there is no problem in life that is so big that if you die to it and allow the goodness that's there to work in your life, you can't address that problem. Maybe not the way you want it to. A lot of times not the way you want it to. But that whatever problems we have in life, when we see them more as just the challenges and chances of life, just what it means to be alive, sometimes part of the brokenness, sometimes part of the healing, when we put them in their proper place, and when we look for the goodness that's being provided to us and apply that goodness to those changes and challenges, then we find the new life that the whole story of Christ is all about. Because basically that's the story of Christ. It is of dying and rising again. And whether we're talking about that literally in terms of Jesus' death and resurrection, whether we're talking about that in terms of our own hope for resurrection, or whether we're talking about that as just an image of how we live life. Death, resurrection, light, darkness. Get caught up in the problems or let the goodness address the changes and chances of life. It's a way of life. And that's what the light is that's the light that is being offered to us. So I was thinking about lists as I thought about this. I was thinking about the lists of problems and things that I deal with sometimes and have dealt with over my life. I mean, I make lists for everything, if anybody knows that. I mean, it used to be on paper, but now it's in my cell phone or on my notebook, or, still a few are on the backs of napkins if I happen to think about it at a restaurant. And there are lists for food I need to buy, there are lists of problems that need to be solved. I have a whole program that lists my tasks at both Good Shepherd and here so I can try to keep up with them. And I can very easily get just caught up in that. But very rarely do I make lists of the goodness that is in my life, unless it's just so outstanding that it knocks me over. But very rarely do I just make lists of the goodness. Oh, I do if I'm on a retreat and they tell me to. I've done sometimes in Lent as a discipline, as a spiritual discipline. But it occurred to me that I do sometimes journal a lot about the problems and things that I have. And I have stacks of journals from years of things like that. So I thought, what would happen if I looked back through there? Would I just see the problems? Or with this vantage point, could I see any of the goodness? And here's what I discovered. I had to write it down because it's still hard to remember all the goodness. I could probably tell you the problems without looking. Here's one. These came from over a period of like 25, 30 years. This happened after somebody that was very important to me had died. And I felt pretty much all alone. And I was a priest at an inner city church that didn't have any money. And so they couldn't pay me very much, so I had to have a regular job. And it was a high-powered, very stressful job. And I pretty much kept those two things sort of separate. But I went back to work finally after this person had died, and a co-worker and her husband, who I just didn't really know that well except for at work, they invited me over to their house for dinner. It was an act of goodness in the midst of a lot of problems. Or I thought about my cat snuggling up to me in bed one night when I went to sleep upset about something. And I'd actually written this in the journal, but I don't think I had given it much credence as goodness at the time. It was all the list of things that were part of that upset and trying to deal with that. Or one of my children calling for no special reason at all one day, just to say hi, to see how I was doing. Or another thing I found written in those journals was about, this was back from my 30s, it was an old, crusty acolyte master who had been absolutely certain that only boys and men should be acolytes. And in my 30s, he decided it was okay to train me to be one. An act of goodness. A seminary professor of preaching who took me under her wing because Jim was in Knoxville and I was in seminary several miles away with 3 kids on my own, trying to do graduate school and keep the kids, and this person didn't just teach me to preach, but helped me get through my time in seminary. A very dear old friend with whom I lost touch, answering my invitation to be a Facebook friend and reestablishing a friendship. A very dear current friend, encouraging me on a day when I felt like I hadn't done even one thing right. And me myself once, recognizing it was time to take a break and leaving work early to enjoy at least a part of a beautiful day. These happened, they were buried in all of my journal entries about the problems I was dealing with at that time, whether they were personal problems or problems with parishes that I was serving. When you pulled them out, there were quite a list of goodness. And you might listen to that and think, well, yeah, that was the goodness of your friend. That was the goodness of your cat. That was the goodness of your child. That was the goodness of yourself. And that's true. It was. It was. But the source of that goodness, whether we recognize it or not, the source of that goodness is God. Because that's the definition of God. God is the goodness that is available to us in the world. And sometimes that goodness gets acted out in our life through death to one thing and resurrection to another. Sometimes that's the instrument through which God has to bring goodness. And sometimes that goodness gets acted out in our life through a cat, or through a friend, or through a child, or through just noticing that day that it is a beautiful day. Those are the instruments of goodness. The source of the goodness is always God. So may we remember that God is the source of goodness. May we remember that all those things we think of as problems are all opportunities to let goodness work in our lives. And may we find ourselves living more in the light of God's goodness than in the darkness of our own angst.